Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our session on Apex. My name is Aaron. I'm a product manager on platform. I was the PM for Apex for a little while, basically keeping the seat warm for this guy, Chris Peterson, who is now the PM and was the guy born for this job. So we're very excited to have him in this role now for the last 9 months. Before we get started, we'll take a look at the forward-looking statement, as basically says any and all purchasing or investment decisions should be made based on what is currently generally available on the product and not about any future-looking stuff that we talk about here today. So we're going to start off basically letting you know that our compiler rollout is complete. If you've attended Apex sessions at Dreamforce in the past, you've heard us talk about rolling out a new compiler that was built for Apex. We spent quite a while rolling this out to make sure that it happened invisibly and there was no customer impact from it. At Dreamforce last year, we're nearly done with this. We had 99% of all the orgs were on the new compiler, but we're still in the process of rolling it out to the long tail. And as we all know about long tails, the last couple hundred customers took us about 6 months to get through to work out kinks in their code and make sure that it was all compatible. But everybody is now operating on the new Apex compiler, and that means two things. That means that the Apex engineering team is back to full strength working on features and performance improvements that you did see the trickle of that slowdown while we were working on the compiler. So we're back at full strength there, and also with the new compiler, we're able to develop new features faster. So we'll hopefully keep a good roadmap coming steadily at you. So we'll take a look at what we've done with that new compiler in the last couple of releases. I want to start off by talking about and make a public service announcement here for Idea Exchange. And thank you again for being in this session, because we know that this is conflicting with the True to the Core session that's happening. If you didn't know that, please don't get out and leave the room. Over the last couple of releases, we've delivered 30,000 points in Idea Exchange points. More than half of those are for a switch statement, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to say that, point out that we really are paying attention to Idea Exchange. And I know sometimes it looks like we're not when ideas are sitting there longer than you would like them to. But we're watching this. So ideas that you have, look for them in Idea Exchange. If they're there, please vote for them. If they're not there, please add them.
And on that note, I wanted to be clear that there's no idea really too small. One of the ways we use Idea Exchange on the product management side, especially for Apex, is trying to find good quality of life improvements to the language. So there's a little chunk of every release that's set aside for trawling through the Idea Exchange and finding little things that'll make somebody's life easier, and finding an engineer who really wants to work on them and making sure those get delivered. So don't just think of Idea Exchange for big bang ideas, but if you have suggestions on how Switch could be improved, even if it's a little tiny thing of support one new type, that's exactly the type of stuff that really makes an impact.
So on that note, these are the things that filled out those 30,000 points, Switch being the first. So with the switch statement that came out in spring, you can switch on most primitives, you can switch on S-objects, and you can use multiple literals in the when condition. Now, if you take a look at when, that should be a hint here that switch is a little bit different than what you may be used to in Java or some other languages. Apex generally is Java-like, but Apex being a domain-specific language, and rather than a general-purpose language like Java, there's a lot more keywords in Apex that are already taken than you would find in Java, because they're things that are used in our product. So in this case, case is an S-object type, of course, and switching on case would create some confusion. It's something we certainly could implement in the back end in the compiler, but it also then becomes confusing for developers writing code and other developers reading that code. So we are switching on the when condition, and this is an idea that came up from the community. The switch statement itself had a lot of design input from the community. Again, kind of spawning from Idea Exchange. So we want to thank all of you for participating in the design review. We posted the draft spec for Switch close to a year ago, got a lot of feedback, and some of the syntax in it, like this, are the things that came out of that. So we think it's a really great feature that you guys helped us design, and we hope that if you haven't taken a look at it, that you'll take a look at it. And because of some of these nuances, make sure you read the documentation first. But I think you'll like that one.
And I should point out, we did a presentation that did a deeper dive on the design behind Switch at Trailhead DX. So if you're interested, take a look at that. It's switching it up with Switch from Trailhead DX that has a deeper dive there.
All right. Another popular one in ID Exchange, you can now count, and that will count as a single row query. So you can do this without blowing through your governor limits. Record type, you can now get the API name for record type. Previously, you could only get the label, and that could create challenges for developers because labels can get changed pretty easily by admins or other developers. Translations, when you have translations, that adds a level of complexity too. So
let's be honest with ourselves. It broke one of our internal orgs when somebody translated the label of a record type, and that was a little bit embarrassing, so we decided we had to go back and retrofit this. So
yeah.
You'll also see the developer name in SOAP API responses as well.
Yeah. So on the theme that Chris was talking about for code size limit increases, we've doubled the amount of Apex that you can write, so that'll give you a lot more headroom in your orgs. And also, as you are refactoring some of your code to take advantage of like new features like Switch and some of the stuff we have coming up, and reducing some of your more verbose code and redundant code. Hopefully, you'll have plenty of space in the org to work with now with 6 million characters. And then finally, you can now instantiate custom metadata types in Apex and edit them in memory without committing them to the database. And this is something that is very useful in writing tests for custom metadata types. Chris, you want to talk about some of the performance improvements we've made?
Absolutely. So most of these rolled out in the summer release, but it's worth a recap because some of them can be pretty substantial. So the first one to talk about is compile on deploy. I wanted to ask if there's any ISV partners in the room. All right, more than a couple. One thing we saw in our observations from ISV partners is that when you did something like a push upgrade, before compile on deploy, when that happened, your subscribers would have all the compiled Apex bytecode invalidated because changes were made to the metadata of their org. And as we saw that happen in a number of customer orgs on the same instance, we could actually see small but noticeable performance impact to the overall health of the instance, and also definite performance impact to your specific customers as Apex was recompiled on next use. So in part for ISVs, but also just for anybody who runs a large enterprise org that always has somebody using it, compile and deploy was something we did to make sure that your end users aren't impacted by you making changes that are built on top of the metadata API. So if you do a metadata deployment, a change set deployment, a packaging operation, to a org that has compile and deploy enabled, it will automatically recompile all Apex in the organization and commit that as part of the metadata operation. So your end users don't see any performance degradation while Apex recompiles on their behalf. This is turned on in all production orgs always and is optional from the setup UI under Apex settings for Scratch orgs, sandboxes, developer editions, etc. There's a slight performance overhead while the recompilation happens, so we recommend you leave it off for orgs that you're going to do interactive development on for any organizations that have a large amount of customer traffic. Or if you're anything that's performance sensitive. If you're using Scratch orgs for performance testing, turn it on. If you're using sandboxes for UAT testing, probably turn it on. Up next, test-driven development. Hopefully a topic near and dear to everybody's heart. I know there's quite a few sessions on it this year at Dreamforce. So we decided to do something to try and help test-driven development be more responsive, which is optionally let you disable test coverage collection. There's a fair bit of overhead in the Apex runtime to keep track of what statements have been executed by what test. And when we turned all that off in some internal experiments, we found there was about a 10%, sometimes 15% improvement in overall test run speed. If you're in a use case like interactive development, where you want to tell if you broke something rather than how much coverage you have, this is a really useful thing to turn on. So the SFDX Apex run command for tests will have this on by default, so it'll turn off coverage by default unless you specifically ask for it to make sure that your tests are more responsive. You can do this through the developer console and the API as well. So turn it off if you don't need it. And finally, deployment cache. This one's less directly visible, but if you run a lot of tests as part of your metadata deployments to, say, production organizations, in part of our profiling, we found that there was a lot of time spent continually reloading metadata from the database because our caching infrastructure didn't used to be able to cache metadata that wasn't yet committed. And because the metadata transaction is still pending, it wasn't able to be cached effectively. So we worked with a number of other teams internally to make sure that the most performance impacting metadata types would still be cached for within Apex test runs as part of a metadata deployment. And as a result of that, we saw, in some cases, up to a 60% improvement in runtime for Apex tests as part of a deployment. So that's on always. It's something you don't have to worry about, but you probably noticed at least some improvement in test performance, and that is very likely a culprit. And with that, let's talk about Winter. With Winter, we introduced batch Apex error events as beta. This is a new type of standard platform event that, based off customer feedback about having trouble debugging batch Apex, is something we've done to dramatically improve the visibility into what's going on with your batch Apex jobs. So to turn this on, all you do is implement the database raises platform events interface. It's a marker interface. There's no special methods. But any batch job that implements this interface will then fire this type of standard platform event on every unhandled exception. That includes uncatchable exceptions, limit exception, unexpected exception for GACs, whatever it is, whatever happens. What's that? Yes, limit exceptions are included. So CPU limits, heap, anything else is included. You will get an error event. One of the things that's most important to this, all the record IDs that were being processed in that execution are included in the event. So you can tell exactly what records failed in your batch processing and why. I should also note, for the few of you who use batch Apex jobs with custom iterators, the two-string implementation of your iterator is used instead of record IDs. So even if you have custom iterators instead of record-based batch jobs, they will support this.
This looks like it's going to be a popular feature.
Yes. It is in beta in Winter for two reasons. One is that before Apex execution starts, there could be potentially platform exceptions that don't yet fire the event. We want to make this bulletproof. So we're calling it beta until we can fix that. And the other is that you can't yet subscribe to it in Flow or Process Builder. Other than that, it's available everywhere. So customers say it best. Daniel Bollinger actually dove into the pre-release orgs before the release notes were out and discovered this. So credit to him. And as a result, we're going to look at his example. So he created a batch Apex job. You can see he added the new raises platform events marker interface. And in the example we're about to see, that line 18 causes an SObject exception because it's putting to a field that isn't valid on the SObject type. So here we have the trigger on batch Apex error event. Like all platform event triggers, it's an after insert. It's the only type that's supported on platform events. And you see it just writing to the debug log with everything that happened, and an example of it really working.
All right, thank you. So that's enough about the last couple of releases. Let's take a look ahead at where we go from here. At a high level, over the next couple of years, these are the areas where we're going to be making investments in Apex. We're making investments into security, and we're going to spend some time talking about that a little bit later in this talk. We'll continue to implement true to the core things that are driven by ID exchange. We are making investments in the Apex language server, in asynchronous Apex, and in platform cache. So over the next couple of releases, these are a few of the things that you'll see coming out. First, you're going to get a better ability to see your org limits in Apex. So you'll be able to you'll be able to get access to all the same information about limits that you can currently get from the REST API, and this will be really helpful in cases like your daily async Apex executions. Platform cache is going to be available in Scratch orgs. It's not going to have the same allocation as you'll get in production. We're looking at probably 3 megabytes. So there's an additional couple of features that will come with that. One is that we'll shrink the minimum partition size because it'll be hard to fit a 5 megabyte partition in a 3 megabyte cache allocation. And the other then is we'll give you the option to automatically shrink your deployed partitions down to 1 megabyte, so you can have multiple partitions in your Scratch org for your testing. And
to add on to the auto shrink capability that we're talking about, one of the things about SFDX is that generally we try and discourage having to pre-process your metadata before you deploy it. So we started looking at how platform cache was used, and organizations have 45, 50 megabytes of it. And so what we didn't want to happen was people having to change their metadata to deploy to a Scratch org versus production. So the idea of the auto shrink feature is that we absorb that hit if you opt into it. We're not going to turn it on for you by default, but that the platform will make your metadata fit rather than you having to take the extra steps as pre-processing.
All right, we will start adding support for Apex refactoring, more support for Apex refactoring in the language server, starting with the symbol rename, and we've got a couple more on the next slide. And we're also working on CRUD and FLS checks, and we're going to spend a bit more time on that as well later in the presentation. So after the next couple of releases, these are things that we've got in the backlog that should be coming a little later next year, early the following year. Continued work on supporting Apex refactoring in the language server. More work on platform cache, specifically making it available in the Apex metadata API so that ISVs can provision it into customer orgs as part of a post-install script or post-upgrade script, and can also change the partition size programmatically in Apex. We're looking at doing anonymous inner classes. Chris tells me this has been requested for a long time. I'm not really sure we should do it because I haven't seen it in ID Exchange. So I don't know, unless somebody decides to post this and start voting on it, I'm not sure we're actually going to bother doing it.
Somebody please post this. I really want this to happen.
And finally, we'll be doing a lot of work on asynchronous enhancements. So you saw some of the stuff with Batch Apex that Chris talked about. We'll continue to build on that and making it more robust and more visible. But we are particularly doing our asynchronous investments are going to be mostly centered on queuables. So one of the things that at some point we will likely do is merge futures into queuables. But regardless, as you're thinking of how you're going to build your apps, please keep in mind that queuables is kind of the way forward for a lot of our asynchronous Apex. We're looking at doing fast queuable. So there are a number of situations where developers are hitting their synchronous Apex limits, and we tell them to take a look at queuables, and it's maybe something in a user interface, and they're saying, well, generally queuables respond well enough for a UI, but it's you can't consistently count on that. So we want to provide the ability to prioritize some of your queuables so that they can any place where you have need for near real time but not actually real time, you can then turn to queuables, and those get bumped up in the queue.
Yeah, that probably will come with some cost to your limits, so they probably won't be as generous as regular queuables. But in exchange for that, they'll go into a faster processing queue. So think of this as something that would be useful for callouts from triggers. Ultimately, those have to be asynchronous. If you want them to happen closer to the trigger execution, but don't really need to do anything beyond a simple callout, this is a wonderful feature for that.
And another thing that we're looking at that's not on here because it's a little more speculative are transaction finalizers. And I don't see Dan Appleman in the room. He's one of our favorite hecklers, and this is something on his wish list. And that will allow us then to remove the limits on, or certainly at least increase the limits on chaining queuables, because it would prevent you from spawning a bunch of queuables that are spawning queuables and a chain reaction that brings down our servers.
It also gets you some of the guarantees of robustness that Batch has. One of the things that keeps people attached to Batch instead of chaining queuables is that if there's an error in Batch processing, it continues on with the next chunk. If you're chaining queuables, one failure causes the subsequent ones to not execute. So the idea of having some sort of callback at the end of your Apex transaction, so even if it fails with a CPU exception, for example, you could still in-queue the next piece of work, is one of the things we're looking at on making queuables much more appealing as a Batch alternative and or replacement.
All right, so we mentioned security a couple of times. It's time to talk about it.
Yes, so new in Winter 19 is inherited sharing. This is something that seems a little bit arcane at first. It's a fairly subtle departure from how Apex worked if you completely omitted the sharing declaration from your class, but with a couple key differences. First and foremost, it is secure by default. If you call into an inherited sharing class that is the entry point to Apex, it acts as with sharing because nothing has explicitly caused privilege escalation. The idea here is that inherited sharing doesn't cause privilege escalation, it just respects it if it's already happened. And that distinction is incredibly important when it comes time for things like security review or code audits. We also made it so that developer intent is explicit. When you saw a class that didn't have a sharing declaration, it wasn't clear to you as a developer, to your auditors, anybody else, if it was intended that way, or if somebody was using an IDE that didn't have sane defaults, or if they just forgot. So the idea of having the developer intent be explicit, especially for something that is a fairly advanced pattern, is another thing that helps beef up the security guarantees, even if it's in a more human rather than technical way. I do want to call out that working with the security review team for the App Exchange, inherited sharing classes are allowed through security review, even if they're global. So for the ISVs in the audience, you can make your service classes, your Apex-centric APIs for your customers inherited sharing so that they could use them in without sharing context if they want to. You shouldn't own the without sharing context, but it is supported for customers to line things up and run them that way if they so choose. So what it does, simply put, the effective sharing mode of the inherited sharing class is inherited from the calling class. Whatever the effective sharing mode of the class that called this one is respected. And we change that up for an entry point for the sake of security to be secure by default. Thanks. So some concrete examples. Let's say we have a Visualforce page with a controller that's inherited sharing. The effective sharing mode for that controller, sample controller in our first swim lane, is with sharing because of that same secure by default we were just talking about. And when it calls into our service layer class, the effective sharing mode stays unchanged. It's a call from Apex to Apex. Inherited sharing doesn't change the effective mode, so your service class is being used in a with sharing context in this example. But let's say we have a Lightning component that needs to do some sort of trusted privileged operation. We need that to run without sharing. So other controller is explicitly declared without sharing. Its effective sharing mode, without sharing. Calling that same service layer class, it is running it as without sharing. So the same class can be used in either sharing mode as necessary. Let's take a look at how that's different, because for anybody who hasn't worked with nuances of sharing before, this does seem a little bit complicated. So as an example of what other controller would do if you didn't have inherited sharing on it, because it's an entry point to Apex, its effective sharing mode would be without sharing by default. So it didn't have that same secure by default behavior that inherited sharing does. And as a result, if it called into another class that didn't have any sharing declaration, it would stay as without sharing. So trying to mimic that first situation from our first slide, where we want it to be secure by default but flexible, we have a problem here. This is going to fail security review because it's accidentally without sharing because of how it was called. I do want to call out that in your entire code base, if you ever emit a sharing declaration right now, stop doing that and move to inherited sharing. Because this next example is the scary part of mixing and matching them. If we have sample controller that does not specify sharing, and then it calls into an inherited sharing class, because the effective sharing mode, rather than what's actually listed on the class, but what sharing context it's running in, is what carries forward, this would be without sharing. So don't mix and match emitting sharing declarations and inherited sharing. Move all your code to inherited sharing unless you have a really good reason not to.
All right, thank you. So that feature there is a special brainchild of Chris's, and this is gonna make a security review and developing secure apps a lot easier for many of our developers. So the natural complement to the row level security is the column level security and the object security. So we've got some work on FLSICRUD coming out, intended to hit this in the spring release. And then we'll do some more work on that going forward. But we really want to help developers get away from having to develop their own security solutions, because these end up with a lot of boilerplate code for checking every field that consumes your code limits. It makes it complicated. It impacts performance as we have to then read all those queries and calculate that, so the customer is going to experience performance hits. It consumes resources on our servers. You can end up with security holes just because the complexity makes it easy to overlook something, or the complexity makes it difficult enough to fix the gap that you would decide not to. And then all that complexity can make it difficult to audit as well. And so you need some advanced tools to review that. The complexity means it takes longer to get through the security reviews, and also because of back to number 3, the higher chance of having security gaps, there's a higher risk of failing a security review with this.
And unfun fact, this is the #1 cause of App Exchange security review failures. So we know it is a definite pain point for partners, and it's very likely a large gap in security for enterprise customers. So it's something we want to make substantial investments in to make sure the tooling catches up to what's really needed by the complex use cases that Apex supports in the wild.
So this is what that's going to look like in practice. In the spring release, we have a query filter that, with security enforced, and this will make sure that the query is respecting CRUD and FLS. It's basically a very binary tool. It either succeeds or it fails. So if the user has access to all the fields, everything will work fine. If the user lacks access to even one of the fields in the query, then the entire thing will fail. So it's a pretty blunt instrument, but it's also really simple and straightforward for developers to use. That in order to then provide to refine the bluntness of that further down the road, we are going to have a method that will basically strip out all of the fields that the user doesn't have access to. So they'll see the fields that they should be able to see, and they'll write to the fields that they should be able to write to, and anything else that's in the query that they don't have access to will just be ignored. That will, that's much more akin to what a lot of developers want to see, but it also, on the other hand, requires a lot more skill on the part of the developer to understand how to deal with the different situations, and for users that are going to see different responses to the same query.
In effect, we're giving you control of where you draw security boundaries, whereas the former, with security enforced, says, I don't want to worry about security, just take care of it for me. So how much responsibility you as a developer are willing to take on will determine how much flexibility you have in how security is enforced.
All right, so before we wrap up, I just want to point everybody to some of the resources available. Trailhead, of course, is the place to go for everything Salesforce. We have a lot of material on Apex and Trailhead. There are 2 modules that are new since the last Dreamforce. One of them for beginners, and then another one on the opposite end of the spectrum for very advanced developers, a new super badge there. And then also I want to point out a few relatively recent blog posts about Apex, one of them by Emily with a lot of support from Chris on best practices around deployment to minimize impact, performance impact or performance degradation on end users for working in your org and deploying your metadata. There's a great blog by Andy Fawcett about using custom metadata types for dependency injection with Apex and Visualforce and Lightning. And then there's a blog post by Peter Chittum that came out around the time we released Switch on how to use Switch and some of the nuances of it and how to refactor some of your code to take advantage of it. So take a look at those. And with that, we will open it up for Q&A.
Anybody with questions, can you come up to the mic? We want to make sure that we get them on the recording.
So is dependency injection on the roadmap at all, like a supported dependency injection?
So we have some support for dependency injection. I definitely recommend taking a look at Andy Fawcett's work on that, because he took the tools that we have today and put really, really nice wrappers around them. So he has a sample repo up on GitHub that's all Apex Visualforce Lightning code that's open source that does real dependency injection. You define a custom metadata type that says what class to load and what component to instantiate, and it handles the rest. Really complex framework that gives you something much more akin to what it seems like you're looking for, of a simple dependency injection system, whereas Apex today has the more primitive features. We want to improve on that, but in comparison to some of the other priorities, polish on that when there are community solutions available hasn't yet hit the top of the roadmap.
Okay. And just another question. The inherited sharing, how does that work with an Apex REST API class?
The Apex REST API class would be considered an entry point, and so if your Apex REST class was inherited sharing, it would run as with sharing when called as a REST endpoint.
All right, thank you.
No other questions?
Well, you were so awesome. And it's not exactly connected to what you're talking about, but I was just wondering if you're ever thinking of implementing like a array unshift or slice or in your lists.
That is exactly the type of thing that should be on the idea exchange. The type of chunk of the roadmap we set aside for quality of life improvements is exactly the type of time we spend on something like that.
Okay, I'll put it in.
And on that, the votes definitely do play a part. So post it tweet it, get some votes to show that there's demand for it. And votes aren't the only thing we look at, but they definitely help show that the demand for it is there.
Cool.
Just to clarify, you said that classes compile and deploy. Does that mean they never go stale anymore?
You can invalidate the bytecode through setup UI operations, but generally, if you are doing everything through a robust change management process, that's correct. And the goal is to get it to the point where Apex doesn't compile on end user requests because it's not a wonderful experience, especially in organizations with a lot of Apex. The blog post that just came out about best practices really evangelizes the same practice and points out that if you want to minimize impact to your end users and make sure that your life stays simple, do everything through a real change management process. So while we're going to look at what we can do for setup UI-based Apex bytecode invalidations, the tools now exist for you to never invalidate bytecode in production if you don't want to.
Well, what about like with managed packages? Because a lot of time I'm working with CPQ and then randomly a class becomes invalidated.
If it is invalidated through something like a push upgrade or a package install
No, the
operation,
package is just sitting there. It hasn't been touched.
that is odd. There would often be something that's the cause of the invalidation. I'll give you a card. I'm curious to take a look at some of the logs on what could have caused that invalidation.
Hi, I have a question. It's more generic, I'd say. Is there any hope for such cool features that other languages have, like streams, for example, in Java and other cool stuff? I understand that under the hood, I think there is still Java 6, but also maybe there are plans to upgrade your background.
So the idea of Apex running on a specific version of Java, the runtime has a lot of things in common with Java 1.6, but it's not really Java 1.6. It's more complex and nuanced than that. So that isn't what's holding us back, because it's not like the Java JDK version is what's holding us back from these. It's that we need to build them in Apex and make sure that they meet all of our criteria for general available features. To your question of, is this something we should have hope for? Yes. Now, the bad news is the timeline is nowhere near concrete, but anonymous interclasses are one of the first steps we want to take on this journey, and that is something that is actually really tangibly on the roadmap, and we're planning to break ground on soon. Streams will be a little farther out, but the work we're doing on FLS and CRUD enforcement, with the amount of null checks that could potentially be involved as a result of stripping fields, things like optional are suddenly becoming very appealing. So we're never going to get this stuff truly for free by just something as simple as upgrading Java version. But at the same time, you should definitely not give up hope for these types of language features. They are a lot easier with the new compiler. It's just a question of where they come in priority compared to things like, do we invest in asynchronous Apex? Do we invest in security APIs? Do we invest in JSON processing? Do we invest in language features like generics? It's a question of competing priorities more than technical viability. So show the demand is there. I know it is, but the more you can illustrate it, the higher it gets on the roadmap. And give us use cases where it really shows the value.
Great, thank you.
Who are you?
So I got one, and then I'll do a second one if no one else gets in line. First one is any hope of a file stream parser of some kind? I can have files in my Salesforce org that are bigger than I can actually consume in an Apex transaction if I want to look at them.
Unlikely in the short term, potentially in the medium term. Some of the way that limit enforcement happens today makes that particularly challenging, but we have a couple research projects that might change that. It's too early for me to really have much hope, but it's changed from a no to a question mark, and so we can hope it continues to trend in the direction of yes.
That would make me happy, because there are a lot of files in an org that I can't actually touch.
Yeah, large file processing in Apex is still not the language's strength, but improving on what you can do without leaving the platform is something that, especially in light of things like GDPR and data residency requirements, is something we'll take a look at. Not in the short-term roadmap, but you know where to find me. I'm sure you'll keep asking me until we build it.
Yep. Thanks, Chris.
Chuck, were you here the whole time?
No.
Okay. We talked about potentially removing the limits on chaining queuables or increasing them. So if that ever happens, you'll have this guy to thank for that.
Right.
Potentially.
Safe harbor.
It's speculative enough we didn't actually put it on the slide, but we are taking a look at doing that.
If you just change the fact that it goes to 1.
Can you use the mic? Sorry, it's for the recording.
Yep. The big problem with them right now is that when you move to an async context, you get changed from 50 to 1, and that's really dumb. Not, yeah.
I've seen code from people who accidentally fork bombed themselves with async Apex, and we want to make that harder. The question is, how do we do that gracefully without subverting your ability to write code? And when we have a good solution to that problem is when we start making serious attempts to relax it.
Just the context for the other people that don't know what we're talking about. When I'm in a synchronous context, I have limits, and I get to use 50 queuables. When I move to async, all my limits double more or less, but my queuable goes from 50 to 1.
Yeah, in effect, you can't fork a queuable into 2 queuables. At least not today.
I was wondering if there has been fixes or if you're planning to fix serialization from to Lightning.
I'm not going to go into how our org chart works, but I will note that that is not something the Apex team actually owns for a number of arcane reasons that aren't particularly interesting. But the team that does own the Lightning bindings for Apex is acutely aware of them, and following the chatter on the relevant bugs, I can tell you there's been a flurry of activity of late.
Thank you. Could we hope for something like Python list comprehensions?
It's been way too long since I last used Python for me to really remember what they're like.
So all too often, I switch back and forth. I have to write a for loop in Apex, and it's a one-liner in Python, and I just kind of dread writing those for loops.
Very likely. I think I have some homework to do to refresh my memory on what Python does there. But you said list. Sorry, remind me of the term.
List comprehension. You express it in a thing that looks like a list or a dictionary, and then you there's an implicit loop inside of the one-liner with the expression that tells what to do with each element, and then you get the list product or the dictionary product.
It's more likely that we'll start off with something using anonymous inner classes, much like how JavaScript uses filter functions, because that's a less far-reaching change, but the same fundamental idea. And I'll go do some research on seeing if there's any ideas that inspire us to do more.
Thanks. I'll post it.
So this old trusty one. I have an execution context that can explode, and I don't have any way to catch that or do so finally or something.
Oh, you missed when we teased transaction finalizers.
Oh, I did.
So they're in the early stages of iterating on design, but the idea is that we would have some sort of callback for when an Apex transaction completes, whether it succeeds or fails, that you could then do something with. Questions about what the limits would be on that context, how you would register it, how multiple would work are still outstanding. So we're very early in the design phase on this. But the fundamental idea of having some sort of callback when your Apex request completes is something that is going to be foundational to our strategy of chain queuables being more robust. And it also is a generally useful way of solving that problem. So we're trying to spend the resources we have on coming up with general solutions that can then be tailored to a specific problem like that. So transaction finalizers, as opposed to something queuable specific, are the direction we're looking.
I think that's really great.
Hi. I just had a question around generics. You touched on it a little bit. Did you say they're on the roadmap, or you're flirting with the idea?
Generics are not currently on the roadmap.
Need to be.
There are some technical challenges beyond just in the compiler and runtime that make them harder than you'd think at a first glance, but the demand, very clear.
Yeah.
I want generics. It's just a question of when I can get them and what I have to give up to get them.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Just a quick question regarding this batch error event. Does it also handle problems in the start method, like when the query times out, or?
It should. If it doesn't, send me an email and I'll make sure that
it's
I.
supposed to.
Yes, it's supposed to fire on anything. So in the start method, you wouldn't have request scope, things like request IDs, but it should fire at any point during the batch execution.
Okay, cool.
The idea is that 255 characters of error information on async Apex ID just isn't enough. We need to give you higher fidelity errors.
Okay, cool. And do queuables also send out this event?
This is specific to batch for the moment.
But will you change that?
Probably not. Batch is unique in that we manage the state of the job for you. So before a batch Apex execution, like the execute method happens, we know what the state is of that context, but you don't. And so that gives us some fairly unique insight into your batch jobs that make them require a custom solution. The idea of having some sort of event on error for anything else is where the idea of transaction finalizers is yet again appealing.
So
because then you can
queuable-
just add a finalizer that says fire a platform event if I died with a limit exception.
Okay. Is there any timeline for those? Right.
Transaction finalizers, not yet. But you've heard me talk about them as key to a number of other plans we have. So there's something we're looking at quite seriously.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy Dreamfest tonight and the rest of Dreamforce.